One of the aspects of I May Destroy You that really stuck out to me was how Michaela Cole was able to cover very serious topics around sexual violence and trauma without ever feeling very pedantic. A large part of this is some very tight episode writing, where rather than give viewers easy situation with obvious right and wrong, Cole writes subplots and backstories that blur the distinction between good guys and bad guys, where she does this by either having a good character do bad things, or by having a victim also do shitty or even abusive things to another person. I think a pretty spot-on example of this is the 6th episode, The Alliance, which gives a glimpse into the past of Theo, a character who runs a support group for sexual assault that Arabella joins. The episode starts out showing Theo in action, where she very importantly states that she detests abuse and assault.
I hate abusers. I think that abuse, grooming, assault, domestic violence are the most vile, abhorrent qualities of our species.
Cue a flashback into her past, where it's expected that it's going to show the reason why Theo is running the support group in the first place, likely as a way to empathetically reach out to others after her own experiences with abuse. Soon it seems like the time has come as a boy named Ryan, without her permission, takes pictures of her while they are having sex. He tries to convince her to let him keep them and even bullies her, saying he won't show them to other people. Eventually, he talks her into taking money for some pictures, but she takes revenge and throws his phone out the window. While it may seem everything is finished, the plot thickens as Leo cuts her legs with a knife she took from the school's kitchen. Soon we find out what she's up to. In class, she fakes being attacked by Ryan in an attempt to get him in trouble. This is a literal weaponization of racist structures that value white women's apparent vulnerability at the expense of black people around them. The accusation, which could ruin Ryan's life, is merely taken at face value by the staff, and it's also discussed by a young Terry and Arabella how their own sadness as black girls is perceived as a threat and contrast.
I swear down, if I cry, all Miss Met will see is weapons of mass destruction leaking out my eyeballs.
As a result, Theo makes a startling transition from victim to perpetrator, where beforehand Ryan's treatment and violation of her was seemingly leading up to why she started the support group. Cole doesn't leave us here, though. Eventually, Terry and Arabella's friend shows them pictures that disproves Theo's accusation, the very pictures Ryan took of Theo without her consent. Arabella is able to use these pictures to reveal Theo's lies to the principal, but the situation becomes trickier as Robert's very violation of Theo is what becomes his saving grace. There is one last twist, though, that revolves around Theo and her family life, which she is currently living with her mom and stepdad. Before we leave the flashback and simply see Theo as some sort of hypocrite or liar, she has a discussion with her parents where it's revealed that her mom forced her to lie about being sexually assaulted by her dad so that she could get full custody of Theo.
My dad never touched me. Now he knows.
Now we can return to the present and replay Theo's statement on abuse, this time confused and unsure of what to think. Who is Theo now? Has her manipulative side remained? Is she running this support group to prey on vulnerable and marginalized women? Or is she honest, speaking from the place of having been used by her mom and coming to terms with the terrible things she's done? We don't get the answers this episode, if even at all. Instead, you simply see Theo and Arabella interact. And eventually, Arabella does become good friends with Theo. What I want to focus on specifically is the way this flashback episode blurs the line between victim and abuser. As said before, we go in expecting to see Theo's trauma, but instead we're left with a huge mess where both Ryan and Theo are culpable of bad things in spite of also being targets. This isn't to say that I think the offenses are equal, because I won't lie, I was ultimately more on Ryan's side, but I do think, though, that in some way these are just different offenses, and that whether they are equal or not is besides the point that the show's trying to make. There are a wide variety of different social tensions and topics the story involves, and there are a plethora of nuanced perspectives one can take depending on what your life experiences are, many of which you can find throughout different episode recaps and discussions online. And I would never fault someone for sympathizing with Theo if that's what their experience more aligns with. It's actually really tough to talk about this because I'm worried on one hand of championing a particular experience at the expense of another, and on the other hand of not rallying strongly enough behind either side. What's sort of implicit in this thinking is that one side is the greater victim or the greater good, which I think Cole is attempting to chart a different path of analysis better suited for untangling like all the complicated shit that's happening. By blurring good and bad, victim and aggressor, I think Cole is attempting to circumnavigate this sort of greater evil talk so that we can more clearly expose the different power dynamics at play and give them each the attention they deserve. This is something that is constantly happening throughout the show, as there's a mix of good characters who do bad things and bad characters who do good things. I think Terry is the best example of a good character who does bad things because she is one of the most supportive people in Bella's life post-assault. Yet simultaneously, she allowed Simon to leave Arabella alone at the club the night of her assault, and she tries to keep this a secret. On the other hand, for a bad person doing good things, you have Zane, who literally assaulted Arabella by taking off his condom during sex, who was allowed by Arabella to give her writing advice on the book she's struggling to write, and this eventually leads to Bella being able to complete the book and independently self-publish. Sort of in the middle, as someone who is both a victim and perpetrator, you have Theo, who while she does take advantage of Arabella's identity as a black woman to gain referral money from the vegan company she worked for, she does talk this out with Arabella, own up to it, and eventually become her close friend. Ultimately, I even think this sort of blurring of victim and aggressor is a part of how Arabella comes to terms with her assault. I feel like a part of her recovery process is seeing a darkness in herself that is similar to her abusers. She spends a lot of the show feeling out this darkness for both better and worse. She vents these feelings at the support group, but she also really gets sucked into online dox the abusers culture, and she hurts her friends and even shows up at Biagio's house and breaks in to force him to talk to her. Near the end of the show, though, she begins to understand how to use this darkness to defend herself, which is shown when she sets very clear boundaries between her and Zane when she's getting his help for her book. The final episode really shows Arabella bridging the distance between her and her assaulter through fictionalizing 3 different final confrontations. In the first narrative, we have a revenge plot that shows Arabella's inner darkness and capability to commit violence, as she personally kills her abuser after he is drugged with help from Theo and Terry. The second narrative then paints the assaulter as more vulnerable and human, as Bella effectively acts as his therapist to talk to him before the cops arrive and arrest him. Once these 2 prior narratives draw Arabella closer to her assaulter by elevating her from a victim and lowering the man from his status as an aggressor, Arabella is able to see herself as capable of taking control in the final narrative, where she has sex with him, tops him, and then allows him to leave her bed the next morning. It actually feels really rude to say that Arabella is blurring the gap between herself and her assaulter, but I do think that it has pragmatic effects for her, and that's why she chose that approach. Firstly, I think that a victim versus abuser dichotomy often implies a powerless victim and an all-powerful abuser. So by blurring that distinction, she is able to begin to see herself as more powerful and her assaulter as less scary. This is very literally what I think the first 2 narratives in the final episode do. They show that Arabella can kill, and that the assaulter can be weak and vulnerable. The second benefit is I think that a world of good versus bad can easily consume you. This is shown by how Bella gets really into social media movements aimed at doxing abusers and voicing vitriol to the point where when her friends make bad decisions, she lashes out and sees them as bad people. The benefit is that once you bypass the emotional exertion of looking for the greater evil, you are more able to calmly examine what is in front of you. In the case of Theo, while Theo was never entitled to redemption, Bella was able to evaluate Theo's past and present self to determine for herself whether she wanted to associate with her, and in the end she was able to get a support group and a friend out of it. She was even able to briefly work with Zane, not to forgive him but to complete her own work, because she was able to see that she could use him to her own benefit. In line with discussions on Theo's flashback story, I think it's once you choose not to deal with good versus bad that you are more openly left with the plain dynamics and actions that you personally have the power to analyze and make decisions from. Ultimately, I think it was through doing this that Arabella was able to find a secure sense of power and autonomy that made her capable of forgiving her friends, reevaluating old enemies, and dealing with bad people. The world is unpredictable and people surprise you in both the best and worst ways, so having this kind of power, while achieved through a more unintuitive approach, makes the complicated world a little less scary.